Welcome back to the Vanguard Vault family, and hello to every single one of you tuning in tonight. I hope you're all doing absolutely fantastic. Whether you're curled up in bed with the lights off, watching on your phone during a late-night shift, or even sneaking this in while the sun is still up, this is a journey you want to forget. Before we dive in, I'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there right now? Drop it in the comments below because it always amazes me how our Vault family comes together from every corner of the globe to share these chilling stories. Now, let me set the scene. Imagine walking down a long, white corridor. The fluorescent lights above flicker, buzzing faintly. The air is stale, thick, and colder than it should be. You turn the corner, and for just a second, you see her. A nurse, dressed in a starched white uniform from another era, standing at the far end of the hall. Her face is pale, her eyes empty. You blink, she's gone, but you swear you can still hear the squeak of her shoes against the tile floor. For decades, urban explorers and former staff have whispered about this nurse, still making her rounds at Manteno State Hospital, even though the last patient left long ago. But here it's the question, why do so many of Illinois' hospitals refuse to let go of their dead? Illinois is a state with a chilling history of mental institutions and sprawling hospitals, places built to heal, but remembered for tragedy. In their prime, they were filled with thousands of patients, the sick, the forgotten, the abandoned. Overcrowding, neglect, and unspeakable treatments turned hospitals into prisons of suffering. And when those doors finally closed, something remained. Some say it's trauma, carved into the walls. Others believe it's the restless dead, patients who never checked out. And you, watching right now, what do you believe? Think about it. When you walk through an abandoned hospital, what exactly are you afraid of? Is it the possibility of ghosts? Or is it the reminder of what it means to lose control, to be forgotten, to suffer without escape? Hospitals carry a psychological weight unlike any other building. They're places of life and death, where final breaths are taken, where agony and despair are whispered into sterile walls. And maybe that's why, decades after they shut down, people still see shadows pacing the halls, still hear screams echoing through locked wards, still feel watched in rooms that should be empty. By the end of this documentary, you won't just hear stories. You'll question what it really means to die inside these walls. You'll wonder if death is an escape, or if these hospitals have trapped something much darker. We'll journey through Illinois' most haunted hospitals, Manteno State Hospital, where disease and overcrowding led to horror, and where whispers and footsteps still echo. Bartonville Insane Asylum, haunted by the legendary gravedigger, Old Book, whose ghost weeps at funerals even after death. Forgotten wards of Elgin State Hospital, Jacksonville Developmental Center, and Lincoln State School, each holding shadows of their past. And along the way, we'll explore not just the ghost stories, but the psychology of fear itself. Why do abandoned hospitals draw us in? Are we chasing the dead, or running from the living memories they stir? So, wherever you're watching, late at night in total darkness, or in the middle of the day with sunlight pouring through your window, turn up the volume, because this is not a journey you'll want to pause. And remember, even if you don't believe in ghosts, these stories are born from real lives, real suffering, and real death. So I'll ask you, if you were alone in a silent, abandoned hospital, and you heard footsteps behind you, would you keep walking, or would you run? By the end of this journey, that question might not be so easy to answer. Our journey begins with one of Illinois' most infamous sites of suffering, Manteno State Hospital. The birth of Manteno. The year was 1929. The world was about to tumble into the Great Depression, and Illinois was already struggling with overcrowded institutions. To solve the problem, Manteno State Hospital was built on a sprawling 1,200 acres of land in Kankakee County, just south of Chicago. From the outside, it looked almost like a small town. Rows of red brick buildings, gardens, a farm, and even its own fire department. But Manteno was no paradise. It was built for thousands, and by the 1930s, it was already bursting with patients. Some came here for treatment, others were simply abandoned by their families. Poverty, illness, and shame filled its halls. By 1950, Manteno housed nearly 8,000 patients, making it one of the largest mental hospitals in the United States. Imagine it. Endless wards of beds lined wall to wall, corridors echoing with voices, screams, and sometimes silence so heavy it felt alive. The tragedy of 1939. Among all its dark history, one event still lingers in Manteno's memory, the typhoid fever outbreak of 1939. Within just a few weeks, more than 60 patients died, their lives cut short, not by mental illness, but by the very conditions of the hospital meant to care for them. Think of the terror spreading through the wards, patients watching others collapse, nurses overwhelmed and terrified, and bodies carried out one after another. Some believe the outbreak wasn't just a tragedy. It was a curse, a sign that Manteno had been poisoned by suffering from the very start. Even today, urban explorers claim they can sense it. They describe walking into certain buildings and feeling their chest tighten, as though the air itself remembers the panic of that year. The haunted halls Manteno officially closed in 1985, but the stories of what lingers behind never stopped. Shadow figures. Visitors often report seeing dark shapes dart across hallways. Some describe them as patients in hospital gowns, others as something less human. Outlines with no features, just heavy presences watching from the corners. Slamming doors. Even when every window is sealed, explorers hear heavy doors slam shut in distant corridors, echoing through the empty wards. Some say the sound is so violent it feels like the building itself is angry. Distant screams. The most chilling stories are the screams, sometimes faint, sometimes piercing. Former staff insist there's no mistaking them. They sound like the cries of patients who suffered in isolation, echoes of lives that ended in despair. One group of investigators swore they heard someone whisper their names inside the old administration building. They were alone, yet the sound was captured clearly on their recording equipment. Psychology of fear at Manteno. But here's where the story gets even more unsettling. When we hear about haunted hospitals, our first instinct is to imagine ghosts. But think about the psychology at play here. These buildings are loaded with collective trauma. Thousands of people lived and died here, many of them in anguish. When you walk those halls, your brain is already primed to expect something. Every creak of the floor, every gust of wind, every trick of the light could become a ghost in your mind. So we have to ask, is Manteno really haunted? Or is the human brain haunted by what it knows happened here? That's the tension that keeps Manteno alive in legend. Even skeptics admit that the atmosphere feels wrong, as though the walls themselves are heavy with memory. A cliffhanger in the dark. But let's not stop here. Manteno's tragedies are just the beginning. In fact, many of the most terrifying accounts come not from the history books, but from first-hand stories of staff and urban explorers who claim to have come face-to-face with Manteno-esque ghosts. And if you thought shadow figures and screams were enough to chill your bones, just wait. Because what those witnesses describe will make you wonder if Manteno is a hospital that ever truly closed its doors. If the history of Manteno feels heavy, the personal accounts will chill you even deeper. Because while facts record the past, it's the stories of those who walked its halls that make the horrors feel alive. Voices of the past. Former staff members who worked at Manteno during its later years often described the overwhelming sense of loneliness. Nurses spoke of wards so crowded they had to walk sideways just to pass between beds. Patients spent hours rocking back and forth, muttering to themselves or staring blankly at the ceiling. One nurse who worked the night shift in the 1970s recalled something she could never explain. She was making rounds when she heard footsteps pacing behind her. She turned, expecting to see a doctor, but the corridor was empty. The sound continued, keeping pace with her. She finished her rounds as quickly as she could and never worked that ward alone again. Other staff spoke of doors unlocking by themselves, or windows that would swing open even when bolted shut. To them, it felt as though Manteno resisted closure, as if the building itself refused to let go of its inhabitants. Urban explorers and the living shadows. When Manteno finally closed in 1985, the buildings were left to decay. Windows shattered, ceilings collapsed, and graffiti covered the walls. But instead of silence, the hospital filled with explorers, thrill seekers, and paranormal investigators. Some explorers describe the overwhelming smell of disinfectant that lingers in certain rooms, even though the hospital hasn't been cleaned in decades. Others say they've walked into a hallway and seen a figure at the far end, only for it to vanish when they approached. One explorer, filming for a documentary, caught what appeared to be a glowing orb moving across a corridor. Skeptics dismissed it as dust, but those who were there insist it lit the hallway like a lantern, pulsing with energy before fading into nothing. Another group swore they saw a woman in white near the old isolation ward. They thought she was another explorer, until she turned the corner and they realized the hallway was a dead end. No one was there. The wandering patients. Perhaps the most unsettling stories are the ones of wandering patients. Explorers have reported hearing the shuffling sound of slippers on tile floors. Some claim to have seen figures in hospital gowns standing at windows, staring out into the night. On one occasion, a group of paranormal investigators said they saw the faint outline of a man sitting in a chair, rocking back and forth. When they approached, the chair was empty, but the motion continued, rocking slowly on its own. Locals say Manteno's fields and tunnels are just as haunted. Workers reported hearing faint moans underground, where service tunnels once connected the buildings. Even passing by on the road at night, drivers claim to see shadows moving in lit-up windows, though the electricity has long been cut. Psychological echoes. But here is the question we have to ask. Why do so many people experience the same things? Shadowy figures, footsteps, cries in the night. These aren't just random events. Psychologists argue that places like Manteno create what's called a trauma imprint. When a location witnesses extreme suffering, people visiting later may project those emotions outward, manifesting them as sounds or visions. In other words, the human brain turns the memory of trauma into a kind of haunting. But paranormal believers argue the opposite, that the sheer intensity of suffering creates an energy too powerful to disappear. That Manteno isn't just haunted by memory, but by the souls of patients who can't find peace. Which side do you believe? Let's make this personal. Picture yourself standing in Manteno's main corridor at night. The walls are peeling, the air is damp, and your flashlight catches dust floating like snow. Behind you, the sound of footsteps. Slow, heavy, getting closer. What would you do? Would you keep walking deeper into the asylum? Or would you run for the exit? Drop your answer in the comments. I want to know how many of you would dare to stand your ground. And remember, Manteno is only one part of Illinois haunted hospital history. Because if you think whispers and shadows are chilling, wait until you hear about Bartonville Insane Asylum, where a gravedigger's ghost still weeps over the dead. Manteno may echo with screams, but Bartonville cries. If Manteno is remembered for its shadows and screams, then Bartonville is remembered for something far more human. Tears. The birth of Bartonville. The Illinois Asylum for the Incurable Insane was first built in the late 1800s near Peoria, Illinois. Its original Gothic-style building was enormous, looming like a fortress over the rolling hills of Bartonville. Locals described it as terrifying even before it opened, but the building was never used. Architects claimed that its design was too oppressive, too inhumane, and it was torn down before it ever housed a single patient. In its place, a new asylum rose in the early 1900s, this time with hundreds of smaller cottage-style buildings meant to feel less like a prison and more like a community. Still, no amount of architecture could soften what Bartonville became. At its peak, it held thousands of patients, men and women who were abandoned by their families, locked away for decades, often until death. Old Book, the Gravedigger. And this is where Bartonville's most famous ghost story begins. Among the staff was a man named Manuel Bookbinder, better known as Old Book. He wasn't a doctor or a nurse. He was the hospital's gravedigger. His job was to bury the countless patients who died within the asylum's walls. But what made Old Book legendary was his compassion. Unlike so many who worked there, he cared deeply for the patients. Whenever a burial took place, Old Book could be seen standing by the grave, crying openly. Every single time. Doctors and patients alike remembered him weeping as the coffins were lowered into the ground. It did not matter if he knew the patient or not. Old Book mourned them as though each were his own family. He became a symbol of rare kindness in a place defined by sorrow. The day of his funeral. Eventually, Old Book passed away. His death was devastating for the asylum. The staff prepared his funeral, held in the asylum cemetery where he had buried so many others. Dozens of patients and workers gathered to pay their respects. As the service began, they heard something strange, the sound of sobbing. Many turned to look, and there he was, Old Book himself, standing in the distance, crying as the coffin was lowered into the earth. Witnesses swore it was unmistakable. His tall figure, his wrinkled face, his hands covering his eyes as tears streamed down. The crowd gasped, some even screamed. The doctor leading the service turned pale, realizing what it meant. Old Book was already in the coffin, yet his spirit wept with them one last time. The weeping ghost. From that day forward, people claimed to see Old Book wandering the cemetery, weeping softly at fresh graves. Others heard his cries in the wind at night, long after the asylum closed. Even now, paranormal investigators who visit the grounds report the sound of faint sobbing carried through the trees. Some describe the sensation of being watched, only to turn and see a shadowy figure standing near the old burial ground. And almost every account shares one detail in common: overwhelming sadness. Unlike other hauntings that inspire fear, Bartonville's most famous ghost stirs something different: grief. To stand in that cemetery is to feel the weight of thousands of forgotten lives, mourned only by a man who refused to let them die in silence. The atmosphere of Bartonville. But Bartonville is more than Old Book's legend. The asylum itself is said to be haunted from top to bottom. Echoing halls. Visitors describe hearing footsteps pacing above them, even when the floors are empty. Whispering voices. Paranormal teams have recorded what sounds like patients speaking faintly, asking for help, or repeating the same phrases over and over. Cold spots. Entire rooms suddenly drop in temperature, sending chills through anyone who enters. The architecture of Bartonville only adds to the feeling. The cottages may have been less intimidating than Manteno's massive wards, but their decay today is haunting. Crumbling walls, broken windows, and peeling paint create the perfect stage for shadows that seem to move on their own. Here's the question: why does Bartonville affect people so deeply? Psychologists suggest it's because Bartonville reminds us of grief we don't want to face. Death is frightening enough, but to die forgotten with only a gravedigger to mourn you is a sorrow we carry as human beings. When we hear about Old Book's ghost, maybe we're not afraid of him. Maybe we're afraid of ending up like the patients he buried, alone, unremembered, crying out for someone to notice. Bartonville's legend is unlike any other. It isn't about demons or monsters. It's about humanity. It's about compassion in the darkest of places, and the possibility that even after death, love and grief can linger. But Bartonville doesn't just have one ghost story. Its cemetery might be guarded by Old Book, but the asylum's night shifts and graveyard workers reported hauntings that were far more terrifying. Because if Old Book weeps for the dead, others scream in anger. If the legend of Old Book leaves us with sorrow, the other stories from Bartonville drag us straight back into fear. Because while Old Book's ghost mourned, many others seemed to rage. The graveyard shift former workers often said the asylum was worst at night. The day might have been filled with the chaos of overcrowded wards, shouting patients, and endless duties. But when midnight rolled around, the silence became unbearable. Guards and nurses on the graveyard shift claimed they heard voices in the hallways, conversations happening in rooms that should have been empty. They'd unlock a door, only to find no one inside. One worker swore he heard a woman sobbing in the laundry room. He followed the sound through the dark, damp corridors, and when he finally reached the source, the crying stopped, leaving the room completely empty. But the moment he turned to leave, the sobbing began again, this time directly behind him. The screams from the ward's visitors and investigators say the abandoned wards are the most terrifying part of Bartonville today. Walking through the crumbling halls, they've reported sudden bursts of sound, blood-curdling screams echoing as though dozens of patients are crying out at once. In one account, a group of paranormal researchers set up recording equipment in an old dormitory. Hours later, when they reviewed the tape, they heard something horrifying. The sound of hundreds of footsteps rushing toward the microphone, followed by screams that grew louder and louder, and then stopped, all at once. The researchers swore they had heard nothing with their own ears while inside. Whatever made those sounds was only captured on the recording. Apparitions in the window's local residents who drive past the ruins of Bartonville at night tell a similar story. Figures standing in the windows. Sometimes it's just a shape. Tall, human, unmoving. Other times it's clearer. Patients in gowns staring out, their eyes dark and hollow. And always, when drivers circle back for a second look, the windows are empty. One man claimed he saw a patient leaning against the glass, pressing his palm flat against the window pane. By the time the man stopped his car, the figure was gone, but the outline of a handprint lingered in the dust. Emotional terror. What makes Bartonville unique isn't just the fear, it is the emotions people feel when they visit. Investigators describe overwhelming waves of sadness, despair, and anxiety as soon as they step onto the grounds. Some have broken down crying without explanation. Others describe a crushing weight on their chest, as though the air itself is mourning. Psychologists might call this empathic resonance, the human brain picking up on the atmosphere of a place tied to immense suffering. But paranormal believers argue it as something more. The emotions of thousands of patients still bleeding into the present, and sometimes that grief twists into anger. Malevolent encounters. Not all the spirits of Bartonville are gentle like Old Book. One nurse in the 1940s claimed she was grabbed by unseen hands while working late in a ward. She felt fingers curl around her wrist, squeezing so hard she screamed. When she pulled free, the skin was marked with red impressions, like fingernails pressing deep into her flesh. In the modern era, explorers tell of being shoved or scratched. A paranormal team once reported hearing growls in the basement, a sound so guttural and inhuman that they fled the building in terror. Could this be the residue of violent patients, restless even after death? Or is it something darker, something feeding off the sorrow and fear of the asylum itself? Interactive question. So let me ask you, would you dare to walk through Bartonville's cemetery at midnight, knowing Old Book might be weeping in the shadows, or worse, that another spirit might be waiting to grab you? Drop your answer in the comments below. I want to know how many of you would take that risk, and how many would keep driving past without looking back. Bartonville's lasting reputation. Today, much of Bartonville has been torn down or left in ruins, but its reputation has never died. Ghost hunters travel from across the country just to step inside its crumbling walls. Paranormal TV shows have filmed entire episodes here, capturing everything from eerie voices to apparitions. And locals? Many refuse to go near it. They'll tell you Bartonville isn't just haunted, it's cursed. A place where sorrow runs too deep, where the dead never rest. A reflection before moving on. And maybe they're right, because Bartonville doesn't just frighten us, it forces us to confront something we don't like to face. Death, loneliness, suffering. The possibility that even in the afterlife, pain lingers. Old Book's tears remind us of compassion. But the screams, the shadows, and the hands reaching from the dark remind us of the opposite, of what happens when humanity is stripped away. So, what do you believe? Is Bartonville a place of memory, heavy with sorrow that tricks the mind? Or is it a place where the spirits of thousands still wander, crying out to be heard? Whichever answer you choose, Bartonville has carved its name into Illinois' haunted history. And the further we go, the darker these stories become. Because Bartonville may be terrifying, but Illinois still has more secrets to reveal. So far we've explored the tragic shadows of Manteno and the sorrowful cries of Bartonville. But Illinois doesn't stop there. Across the state, hospitals and institutions carry reputations just as chilling, each with its own blend of history, tragedy, and ghostly legend. Let us take a journey through 3 more of Illinois' most haunted hospitals: Elgin State Hospital, Jacksonville Developmental Center, and Lincoln State School. Elgin State Hospital, the City of Shadows. Founded in 1872, Elgin State Hospital, also called Elgin Mental Health Center, was once the largest psychiatric facility in Illinois. At its peak, It sprawled across hundreds of acres, housing more than 8,000 patients in a maze of red brick buildings. Like Manteno and Bartonville, Elgin became infamous for overcrowding, experimental treatments, and the slow decay of human dignity. But Elgin's hauntings are particularly well known. Urban explorers and staff alike tell stories of shadow people roaming the halls. These aren't vague shapes seen out of the corner of an eye. Witnesses describe tall, human-like figures with no faces, gliding across hallways and disappearing through walls. Some investigators claim the shadows even follow them, appearing closer and closer until they vanish completely. One explorer swore that while walking down a basement corridor, he saw a shadow rise up from the floor and stretch across the ceiling, blotting out the dim light from his flashlight. He left immediately and has never returned. Voices are another common report. Elgin's abandoned wards are said to echo with whispers, sometimes clear words like, "Help me," or "Get out." Paranormal teams have captured electronic voice phenomena, EVPs, with chilling results, including one tape where a man's voice mutters, "I'm still here." The scariest accounts, however, involve the tunnels beneath Elgin. Like many state hospitals, Elgin had underground service tunnels connecting its buildings. Today, they are crumbling, dark, and filled with stale air. Explorers claim the tunnels are alive with activity, footsteps echoing behind them, cold winds that come from nowhere, and the sound of someone breathing right over their shoulder. For many locals, the tunnels of Elgin aren't just haunted, they're cursed. Few dare to step inside. Jacksonville Developmental Center, the Forgotten Screams. If Elgin is known for its shadows, then the Jacksonville Developmental Center is remembered for its silence, a silence broken by screams that should no longer exist. Jacksonville was originally founded in the mid-1800s as the Illinois State Asylum and Hospital for the Insane. Over the decades, it became a facility for the mentally ill and developmentally disabled, housing thousands of patients. Like other institutions of its era, it was plagued by overcrowding, neglect, and inhumane treatments. It officially closed in 2012, leaving its sprawling campus abandoned. But locals insist that Jacksonville didn't close quietly. Neighbors report hearing screams at night, long drawn-out cries echoing from the empty buildings. Some describe them as children's voices, others as adult patients wailing in despair. Police have been called multiple times, only to find the grounds completely deserted. One urban explorer described walking through a patient ward when he suddenly felt a hand brush against his back. He turned, but no one was there. Moments later, he heard a voice whisper, "Don't leave me." Terrified, he ran out and refused to go back. Paranormal investigators have captured disturbing audio here as well, banging on doors, footsteps following their team, and even a loud scream so powerful that it drowned out their equipment. What makes Jacksonville especially eerie is its emptiness. Unlike Bartonville or Elgin, which retain decaying remnants of their past, many of Jacksonville's buildings stand stark and barren, stripped of furniture and equipment. And yet, those who enter say the atmosphere is suffocating, as if unseen eyes are watching from every corner. Lincoln State School and Colony, the agony of the forgotten. Perhaps the darkest of Illinois' forgotten institutions is the Lincoln State School and Colony, originally founded in 1877. This facility was designed for individuals with developmental disabilities, many of whom were abandoned by families who could no longer care for them. At its peak, Lincoln housed over 4,000 residents, most of them children. Conditions were notoriously harsh. Patients were often left in overcrowded dormitories, subjected to neglect, and forgotten by the outside world. Investigations in the mid-20th century exposed abuse, leading to national outrage. But even after reforms, Lincoln's reputation never recovered. It finally closed in the early 2000s, leaving behind a legacy of pain and, many believe, restless spirits. Visitors report the sounds of children crying in the empty dormitories. Some claim to hear the rhythmic pounding of fists on walls, as though patients are still begging to be released. Others describe apparitions of small figures darting through the halls, their faces blurred and indistinct. Perhaps the most terrifying stories involve the screams. Multiple explorers have sworn they heard agonizing cries that echoed through the buildings, bouncing from wall to wall until it felt like the entire structure was alive with suffering. One paranormal team recounted entering a classroom where toys had been left behind. As they set up their cameras, a ball rolled slowly across the floor, even though no one had touched it. Seconds later, the room filled with the sound of children's laughter, captured clearly on audio recorders, but heard by none of the team members in real time. The Lincoln State School's legacy is one of sorrow, abandonment, and loss. And the idea that the voices of those children might still linger is enough to haunt anyone who dares step inside. Stitching the stories together. Taken alone, each of these places, Elgin, Jacksonville, Lincoln, is chilling enough. But together, they form a tapestry of Illinois' haunted history. A history marked not just by ghosts, but by human suffering that refuses to stay buried. Elgin gives us shadows in the tunnels. Jacksonville delivers screams from empty halls. Lincoln forces us to hear the cries of forgotten children. And when you put those pieces together, you start to wonder, maybe Illinois isn't just a state with a few haunted hospitals. Maybe the very soil of Illinois is soaked with trauma, echoing in every abandoned ward and every silent corridor. The cliffhanger before analysis. So far, we've walked through darkness, grief, and horror. But here's the question that lingers. Why are we so drawn to these places? Why do thousands of people travel every year to wander abandoned hospitals, to chase the very fear that makes their hearts race? Are we simply chasing a thrill? Or are we trying to understand something deeper about ourselves? About death, trauma, and the possibility that the veil between worlds is thinner than we think? That's exactly what we'll explore next. The psychology of fear, the science of hauntings, and the possibility that maybe, just maybe, the ghosts of Illinois aren't just in our heads. We've wandered through the darkened wards of Manteno, listened to the weeping of old Book at Bartonville, and heard the screams that still echo from Elgin, Jacksonville, and Lincoln. But now it is time to step back, to ask the deeper question. Why do these places affect us so powerfully? Are we simply scaring ourselves with stories? Or is there truly something paranormal at work? Let's pull apart the psychology of fear, the science of hauntings, and the possibility that the shadows in Illinois' hospitals are more than just tricks of the mind. Why hospitals haunt us? First, let's think about the setting itself. Hospitals, especially psychiatric ones, are already symbols of human fragility. They are places where the sick and dying come to face their last moments, where pain, fear, and grief saturate the walls. For the living, just walking into an abandoned hospital instantly triggers unease. The smell of dust and mold, the creak of a door swinging open on its own, the echo of footsteps in a place that should be silent. All of these sensory cues feed directly into the amygdala, the part of the brain that processes fear. Psychologists call this the uncanny space effect, when a place feels wrong, not because of what's there, but because of what's missing. A hospital should be full of people, doctors rushing, nurses calling orders, patients filling the beds. When it's empty, that absence becomes a presence in itself. Our minds fill in the void with imagined horrors. Trauma imprinted on place. Another explanation lies in the idea of emotional residue. Places like Manteno or Lincoln witnessed generations of trauma, isolation, neglect, abuse, and death. Even if you don't believe in ghosts, those emotions can affect visitors in powerful ways. Think of it this way. Emotions are contagious. If you walk into a room where people were just laughing, you feel lighter, even if you don't know why. If you walk into a place where people were grieving, you feel heavy, even without context. Now imagine stepping into a building where thousands of patients suffered in silence, where treatments like electroshock and lobotomies were performed without mercy. That collective trauma can leave behind what researchers call psychic impressions. Skeptics might call it suggestion. We know the history, so we project our feelings onto the space. Believers argue the opposite, that the energy of suffering lingers, absorbed by the walls, floors, and air itself. And when we step inside, that energy reawakens, whispering to us through fear, sadness, or even apparitions. The psychology of ghost sightings. So, What about the actual ghosts? The shadows, the voices, the apparitions in the windows? Psychologists have long studied why people see or hear things in haunted places. One major factor is pareidolia, the brain's tendency to find patterns where none exist. A shadow in the corner becomes a human figure. The hum of an old pipe sounds like a whisper. The brain fills in the gaps because it craves meaning, even in randomness. Another factor is suggestibility. If you walk into Bartonville already knowing about Old Book, your mind is primed to interpret strange sensations as his ghost. This doesn't mean you reimagining it. It means your brain is filtering reality through expectation. But here's where things get interesting. Not all experiences can be explained so easily. When psychology falls short, some paranormal investigators argue that psychology explains part of the puzzle, but not all. Take the example of electronic voice phenomena, EVPs. At Elgin, researchers recorded voices saying, "Help me, and I'm still here." If no one heard those voices in real time, how do they appear on recordings? Skeptics claim it's just audio interference, but believers see it as proof that spirits are trying to communicate. Or consider the physical encounters. People being scratched, shoved, or grabbed by unseen hands. Psychology can explain hallucinations, but it can't explain red claw marks on someone's arm. And what about the stories that come from people who don't know the history? Time and again, visitors who were unaware of Bartonville's legends have described seeing a man crying in the cemetery, matching perfectly with the story of Old Book. Coincidence or evidence? Trauma loops, the theory of residual hauntings. One of the most fascinating theories in paranormal research is the idea of residual hauntings. This suggests that ghosts aren't always conscious entities. Sometimes they are simply recordings of trauma that replay over and over. Think of it like this. When a place experiences intense emotion, grief, terror, anger, it leaves behind an energetic scar. That scar plays back like a loop, and sensitive people can tune into it. This would explain why so many hauntings in Illinois' hospitals feel repetitive. The sobbing at Bartonville, the footsteps in Elgin's tunnels, the children's laughter at Lincoln. These aren't necessarily spirits reaching out. They might be echoes of moments frozen in time, playing endlessly in the fabric of the building itself. Intelligent hauntings, the spirits that respond. But then there are the other kind of hauntings, the ones that respond. When an investigator asks, "Is someone here?" and a voice answers yes. When an object moves on command. When footsteps follow you as you run. These are harder to dismiss. If residual hauntings are recordings, then intelligent hauntings suggest conscious entities, spirits of the dead still aware, still active, still unwilling to leave. Illinois has both kinds. Old Book's weeping may be residual, repeating endlessly at each funeral. But the voices calling explorers by name, or the hands gripping nurses in the dark, those point to intelligence, to something very much alive in death. Skepticism versus belief. Of course, not everyone agrees. For every paranormal investigator convinced of ghosts, there are scientists who insist it's all psychology, faulty memory, or the brain reacting to stress. Skeptics point out that many ghostly sensations, chills, feelings of being watched, sudden dizziness, can be caused by infrasound. These are low-frequency vibrations below the range of human hearing. They can be generated by old buildings, air systems, or even weather. Studies show infrasound can trigger anxiety, dread, and even visual hallucinations. But believers counter with this. Not all hauntings can be reduced to vibrations. Not all voices can be dismissed as noise. And not all shadows can be explained away. Why we keep coming back. So why, knowing all of this, do we keep exploring haunted hospitals? Why do documentaries, ghost tours, and urban explorers flock to places like Manteno, Bartonville, and Elgin? The answer may be both psychological and spiritual. Psychologically, we are drawn to fear. Horror movies, haunted houses, ghost stories. They give us the thrill of danger without the risk. Walking through an abandoned asylum lets us flirt with terror while still being safe enough to leave. But spiritually, these places call to something deeper. They make us wonder about life after death, about the human soul, about whether suffering truly ends when the body does. Haunted hospitals force us to confront our biggest questions. What happens when we die? Do we linger? Can pain outlast life itself? Bridging the two worlds. Maybe the truth is somewhere in between. Maybe the psychology of fear and the reality of the paranormal are two sides of the same coin. Fear primes our brains to notice shadows and whispers. Trauma imprints itself onto buildings. And sometimes, just sometimes, those shadows and whispers aren't only in our heads. Because if even one story from Manteno, Bartonville, Elgin, Jacksonville, or Lincoln is true, if even one voice, one shadow, one sobbing figure is real, then it changes everything. It means death is not the end. It means hospitals aren't just places for the living. They are places where the dead gather, waiting, remembering, and sometimes still reaching out. And so we stand at the threshold. We've studied the science, felt the fear, and considered the spirits. But one final question remains. What does it mean for us? Because Illinois' haunted hospitals aren't just about history or ghosts. They're mirrors, forcing us to look inward, to confront our fears, our mortality, and the possibility that the veil between life and death is far thinner than we imagine. And that's where we'll end our journey. In the conclusion, where one last chilling story ties everything together, and where you'll be left wondering if you truly want to sleep with the lights off tonight. And now, Vanguard Vault family, we've come full circle. From Manteno's restless shadows to Bartonville's weeping gravedigger, from Elgin's tunnels to the cries of Lincoln's forgotten children, we've walked together through some of Illinois' darkest corners. But here's the truth. These hospitals are not just ruins. They are living graveyards. Every hallway still remembers. Every cracked window still watches. Every echo in the silence might be more than your imagination. One final story. Before we close, let me leave you with one last story. A few years ago, a group of explorers entered the old grounds of Manteno State Hospital. They had heard the legends, but they were skeptics, convinced they'd find nothing more than dust and graffiti. As they reached one of the long, empty wards, they decided to test their nerves. One of them shouted into the darkness, "Is anyone here with us?" At first, silence. Then, a faint sound. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, moving closer. They laughed nervously, telling themselves it was just the building settling. But the footsteps grew louder, closer, until they were right behind them. One of the explorers turned, flashlight cutting across the hallway, and froze. Standing in the beam of light was a man in a hospital gown. Pale skin, hollow eyes. His lips moved, whispering something none of them could hear. In an instant, the figure vanished. The ward was empty again. The explorers fled, not stopping until they were outside in the cold night air. Later, reviewing their audio, they heard a voice, soft, raspy, whispering a single word, their name. What do we make of this? Maybe it was a trick of fear, maybe it was real, but either way, that moment forced those explorers, and now us, to ask the ultimate question. Does death really mean escape? Or can the traumas of life follow us into eternity? These hospitals stand as reminders that we cannot always separate the living from the dead, the past from the present. They are scars on Illinois' history, and maybe doorways into something far stranger. Your turn, Vanguard Vault family. So now I'll turn the question over to you. Would you spend a night in one of these hospitals, Manteno, Bartonville, Elgin, Jacksonville, or Lincoln, completely alone, in the dark? Or would you keep your distance, letting the ghosts of Illinois remain undisturbed? And here is something I want from you in the comments below. Tell me where you're rewatching from, and what time it is right now. Are you watching this at midnight with the lights off? At 3 a.m. when the world is silent? Or maybe during the day, thinking you're safe from the shadows? Because the truth is, time doesn't matter. Day or night, safe or not, the walls of these hospitals have seen too much to stay quiet. By now, you've heard the screams, walked the halls, and stared into the darkness of Illinois' haunted hospitals. And whether you believe these are echoes of trauma, tricks of the mind, or restless spirits, one thing is certain: these places are not empty. So tonight, when you turn off this video, I want you to listen closely. Listen to the silence in your own home. Listen for the creak of the floorboards, the whisper of air through the vents, the faint shuffle of footsteps where no one should be walking. Because the ghosts of Illinois may not stay in Illinois. Sometimes, when you invite the story in, the story follows you home. If you've made it this far, thank you for being part of the Vanguard Vault family. Make sure you hit that like button if this journey chilled you, subscribe for more deep dives into history's darkest corners, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next haunting. But most importantly, drop your thoughts below. Would you dare to spend a night in Manteno or Bartonville? Which story shook you the most? And where in the world are you watching from right now? I'll be reading through the comments, and I can't wait to see your answers. Until next time, check your lights, listen to the silence, and remember, the dead don't always stay buried.